The knock came at dawn, hard enough to shake the door on its hinges. Eleanor Hartley was already awake. She had not slept, not really, not since the letter arrived 3 days ago telling her the last of her husband's shipping contracts had fallen through. She pulled her shawl tight and opened the door before the man outside could knock again. 3 men stood on her step. Behind them stood a cart, empty, waiting. "Mrs. Hartley," said the tallest one, holding a folded paper like a weapon, "we're here for the furniture, by order of the court." "You cannot be here for the furniture," Eleanor said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands, hidden in the folds of her shawl, had curled into fists. "I have 30 days to answer the debt. The letter said 30 days. "The letter was wrong," the man said, without a shred of apology in his face. "Mr. Whitfield changed the terms last night. You have until noon." Noon? It was not yet 7 in the morning. Eleanor stood in the doorway of the house that had been her husband's and his father's before him, and felt the floor tilt beneath her feet the way it had the day they told her Robert Hartley was dead. She had survived that day. She told herself she would survive this one too, though she did not yet know how. "I need to speak with someone," she said. "There must be a person I can speak with about this." The man almost smiled. "There's a solicitor in town who's been asking after you. Man named Grady. Says he's got business that might interest a woman in your position. Might be worth a visit before we come back with the cart." He did not explain further. He simply turned and walked back toward the street, his 2 companions following, leaving Eleanor alone in the doorway with the cold morning air and a name she had never heard. She dressed in the only good coat she owned and walked the 11 streets to Grady's office with her chin high and her stomach hollow. She had learned in the 2 years since Robert's death that the world respected a widow who kept her back straight far more than one who wept in public. Weeping solved nothing. It never had. Grady's office smelled of tobacco and old paper. He was a thin man with ink-stained fingers who did not rise when she entered, only gestured toward the chair across from his desk. "Mrs. Hartley," he said, "you're later than I expected. I was told you'd come yesterday." "I received no message yesterday." "No matter, you're here now." He folded his hands. "I have a client, a man of considerable means and considerable reputation, who requires a particular service and who is prepared to pay for it in full. Enough to clear every debt against your husband's estate. Enough, in fact, to see you comfortable for years beyond that." Eleanor felt something cold move through her chest, something that was not quite fear and not quite hope. "What service?" "He needs a bride." She almost laughed. The sound that came out of her was closer to a cough. "Then he does not need me. He needs a woman who wishes to be a wife." "He needs a woman who does not wish to be a wife," Grady corrected, "which is precisely why you were suggested. This is not a courtship, Mrs. Hartley. It is an arrangement, 6 weeks, perhaps 8. You appear at his side as is intended. You attend the events required of you. In return, your debts vanish, and you walk away with your name and your independence both intact." "Who is this man?" Grady hesitated, and in that hesitation, Eleanor understood that the answer would matter more than anything else he had said. "The Duke of Kestrel." The room went very quiet. Eleanor had heard the name before, the way everyone in the city had heard it, spoken low and quick, as though saying it too loudly might summon its owner. They called him the Reaper of Kestrel Hall, a man whose own household staff did not meet his eyes, a man who had, according to every rumor she had ever half believed, driven 2 business partners into ruin and never once raised his voice while doing it. "I have heard of him," she said carefully. "I have heard nothing good." "Reputation is a costume, Mrs. Hartley, same as any other. Whether it fits the man beneath, I cannot say. What I can say is that his coin is real, and your debt is real, and by noon today you will have neither a home nor a choice unless you make one now." Eleanor thought of the cart waiting outside her door. She thought of the furniture that had belonged to Robert's mother, the ledgers that were the only thing standing between her and complete ruin, the small, stubborn pride that had kept her upright through 2 years of widowhood without asking anyone for help. Pride, she had learned, did not pay debts. "I will meet him," she said. "Today, before noon if it can be arranged, because I no longer have a home to protect past that hour." Grady almost smiled. "It has already been arranged. He is expecting you within the hour." The Duke's townhouse stood apart from its neighbors the way its owner apparently stood apart from society, tall and dark-stoned and unwelcoming, with iron gates that looked as though they had never once been opened for a guest who mattered. A footman led Alina through a hall lined with portraits of unsmiling ancestors, and into a study where a man sat behind a desk with his back to the window, so that the morning light fell around him instead of on him, leaving his face in shadow. "Mrs. Hartley," he said without rising. His voice was low, even the kind of voice that did not need volume to command a room. "Sit, please." She sat. "You know why you are here." "I know what I was told," she said. "I would prefer to hear it from you." For a long moment he said nothing, and in the silence she finally saw his face clearly as he leaned forward into the light. He was younger than she expected, and colder in his stillness than in any feature, as though the coldness were something he wore on purpose, over whatever sat underneath it. "My brother died 18 months ago," he said. "He left behind a daughter 7 years old and named me her guardian. The court that must confirm that guardianship meets in 6 weeks. They have made it known, through channels I cannot ignore, that an unmarried man with my reputation is not considered a fit guardian for a young girl. I require a wife. I do not require a marriage. Do you understand the difference?" "I believe I do." "You will be introduced as my intended. You will attend the events required to convince the court of my suitability. You will not be required to share my company beyond what is necessary for the performance to be believed. At the end of 6 weeks, whatever the court decides, you will be released from the arrangement with your debts cleared and a settlement besides. Is this acceptable to you?" Alina studied him, this man the whole city feared, and found that what unsettled her most was not his coldness but the exhaustion beneath it, buried so deep she doubted he knew it showed. "There is a child," she said, "a little girl who has already lost a father. Does she know what this is, that I am not real?" Something shifted in his face so briefly she nearly missed it. "She knows nothing. She is 7. She has lost enough without adding my arrangements to the list." "Then she will believe I am truly to be her aunt." "For 6 weeks, yes." "And when the 6 weeks end and I disappear, what will she believe then?" The Duke did not answer immediately, and Alina understood in the silence that followed that he had not thought that far ahead, that the girl's grief was a variable he had not accounted for in his careful arrangement, and that this oversight troubled him more than he wished to show. "That is a bridge to be crossed later," he said finally. "Do we have an agreement, Mrs. Hartley?" She thought once more of the cart outside her door, of the noon deadline drawing closer with every minute she sat in this cold, beautiful room. She thought of Robert, and of the 2 years since his death spent proving to herself and no one else that she could survive without leaning on any man again. She thought, finally, of the little girl she had not yet met, who would wake up tomorrow to a stranger playing the role of family, and felt a strange, unexpected pull toward protecting her, sight unseen. "We have an agreement," Alina said, "on one condition." "Name it." "Whatever this is to you, a transaction, a performance, I will not have the child hurt by it. If I am to wear her aunt's face for 6 weeks, I will wear it honestly for her sake, even if it is a lie for everyone else." The Duke studied her for a long moment, as though reconsidering something he had believed settled. "Agreed," he said. He rose then and extended his hand, not for the practiced clasp of a business deal, but the way a man offers a hand to help someone up. And Alina took it before she could question why the gesture felt like more than it should have. Within the hour her debts were cleared. Within the day, her furniture stayed exactly where it stood. Within the week, she would move what remained of her small life into a house with iron gates and unsmiling portraits, to become, for 6 weeks, the bride of a man the whole city called the Reaper, and pray she remembered every single day that none of it was supposed to be real. She did not yet know that keeping that promise would prove to be the hardest work of her life. The little girl was hiding under the dining table when Alina arrived with her single trunk, and no idea what to expect. Alina noticed the small shoes first, poking out from beneath the long tablecloth, and rather than announce the discovery to the housekeeper standing beside her, she knelt down slowly and peered underneath. "I don't suppose you'd like some company down there," Alina said. "It's rather cold out here in the hall, and I hear it's warmer under tables. Something about the air." There was a pause, then a small voice. "Are you the new one?" "I'm the new one," Alina agreed. "My name is Alina. What's yours?" "Della, a beat. You're not going to make me come out." "I wasn't planning on it. I was rather hoping you might invite me in instead." Another pause, longer this time, and then the tablecloth lifted an inch, just enough for a pair of solemn brown eyes to study her. Della had her uncle's stillness. Alina would learn later, the same careful watchfulness, as though the girl had decided long ago that trusting too quickly only led to loss. "You can come in," Della said finally, "but you have to sit properly. Nobody stands under a table, that defeats the purpose." Alina gathered her skirts and folded herself beneath the tablecloth, sitting cross-legged across from a 7-year-old girl in a dress far too formal for hiding places, and felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in longer than she could remember. "What are we hiding from?" Alina asked. "Nothing," Della said too quickly. "I just like it under here. You can see everyone's shoes and nobody can see your face, so you know exactly how they're feeling before they know you're watching." "That's very clever." "Uncle Adrian says I notice too much for someone my age." "I don't think there's such a thing as noticing too much," Alina said. "I think there's only people who don't like being noticed." Della considered this with the seriousness of a much older person. "He's not scary," she said suddenly, as though defending someone from an accusation Alina hadn't made. "Everyone says he is, but he reads to me every night, even when he's tired, even when his hands are shaking from being tired, and he never once made me feel like a bother, even after." "After what?" Della's face closed like a door. "Nothing after nothing." Alina did not push. She had learned in her own grief that some doors needed to be left alone until the person on the other side chose to open them. "Well," Alina said instead, "I think I should very much like to be your friend, Della, whatever your uncle says about you noticing too much. I happen to think noticing things is one of the most useful skills a person can have." For the first time, Della smiled, small and quick and real. "You have to pass the test first." "What test?" "You have to guess what I'm thinking just from my shoes like I do. If you're wrong, you're not allowed to be my friend yet." Alina laughed before she could stop herself, and from somewhere above the table, she heard a second sound, low and startled, as if a man unaccustomed to laughter in his house had just heard some for the first time in longer than he could remember. She looked up through the gap in the tablecloth and found the Duke standing in the doorway, watching them both with an expression she could not read, something caught between surprise and a feeling too raw for him to name even to himself. "Uncle Adrian," Della called out, entirely unbothered by being discovered. "Alina is under the table with me. She's very good at hiding for someone who arrived only an hour ago." "So I see," Adrian said. His voice had none of the cold command Alina had heard in his study. It was quieter here in his own home, with his niece's small hand tucked into hers beneath a tablecloth neither of them had planned on sharing. Alina climbed out first, straightening her skirts, aware suddenly of how she must look, dust on her hem, hair coming loose from its pins, nothing at all like a duchess to be. "Forgive me," she said. "I was told to make myself comfortable. I didn't realize that meant the floor." "No forgiveness required," Adrian said. "It's the most she's laughed in months." There was something unguarded in the way he said it, something that told Alina more about the man than any rumor ever had, and she filed it away without examining it too closely, the way she had learned to file away anything about him that felt like more than business. The days that followed settled into a rhythm neither of them had planned for. Breakfast at 8, where Della insisted on sitting between them and narrating everyone's mood based on how they buttered their toast. Fittings in the afternoon, where a seamstress pinned silk against Alina's shoulders while Adrian stood nearby reviewing correspondence, occasionally glancing up at choices of color or cut with an opinion he seemed surprised to have. Evenings when Della would not go to sleep without a story, and increasingly, without both of them in the room to tell it. Alina had expected 6 weeks of distance. What she found instead was a household slowly rearranging itself around her presence, staff who stopped flinching when she entered a room, a girl who had begun, without asking permission from anyone, to call her something softer than her name. She had not expected to notice the way Adrian read aloud, his voice dropping into something unhurried and warm that matched nothing the city said about him. She had not expected to catch herself listening for the sound of his study door, or to feel a small, unwelcome disappointment on the evening's business kept him away past Della's bedtime. She certainly had not expected the argument. It happened on a Tuesday, over cargo insurance of all things, when a merchant named Fenwick arrived at the house under the mistaken belief that because Alina was soon to be a duchess, she could be spoken to as though her opinions were decoration rather than substance. He had come about a shipping contract left over from her husband's estate, one she had fought for weeks to secure fair terms on, and he made the error of assuming her new position meant she would simply agree to whatever terms he offered now. "Mrs. Hartley, surely a woman in your position has no further need to concern herself with such small matters," Fenwick said, in the tone of a man used to being agreed with. "I'm certain the Duke would prefer his household not troubled by trade disputes." "The Duke has no opinion on my trade disputes," Alina said, "because they are not his. This contract belongs to my late husband's estate, which remains mine to manage, regardless of my current address. Your revised terms shortchange the insurance on 3 separate shipments, Mr. Fenwick, and I will not be signing them today or any day until they are corrected." Fenwick's face reddened. He opened his mouth to argue further, and it was then that Adrian appeared in the doorway, having heard raised voices from down the hall, though his own remained perfectly level. "Is there a difficulty?" he asked, in a tone that made Fenwick's spine straighten on instinct. "No difficulty, Your Grace," Fenwick said quickly. "Simply a misunderstanding about the lady's authority in the matter." "There is no misunderstanding," Adrian said. "Mrs. Hartley's authority over her own estate is not a matter for your revision, Mr. Fenwick, and I would suggest you correct your terms before you return, rather than test how patient I am willing to be on her behalf." Fenwick left within minutes, contract unsigned, his confidence considerably diminished. Alina stood in the hallway afterward, oddly breathless, aware that Adrian had not needed to intervene at all, that she had been holding her own perfectly well before he arrived, and yet something in the way he had said on her behalf sat warm in her chest regardless. "I didn't need rescuing," she said, when the door had closed behind Fenwick. "I know," Adrian said. "You'd already won before I arrived. I simply enjoyed watching the end of it." It was the closest thing to a joke she had heard from him, and it startled a laugh out of her, unguarded and real, and for a moment they simply stood there in the hallway, looking at each other in a way that had nothing to do with performance, and everything to do with something neither of them had agreed to feel. The public test came 3 nights later, at a ball hosted by Adrian's cousin, the very event meant to put their engagement in front of every eye that mattered to the court's decision. Alina wore blue silk chosen during that first fitting, and walked into a ballroom full of people who had spent years whispering about the Reaper of Kestrel Hall, watching now to see what manner of woman had agreed to marry him. She managed the whispers well enough. She managed the pointed questions about her late husband, about her modest fortune, about how quickly the engagement had come together, all with the same steady composure that had carried her through 2 years of widowhood. What she did not manage, what no one could have prepared her for, was the moment a guest named Lord Caro placed a hand on her shoulder to guide her toward the dance floor, a touch meant as nothing more than fashionable courtesy. She felt herself go rigid before she understood why. The room narrowed. Her husband's voice surfaced somewhere behind her ribs, low and certain the way it always had been in the months before he died, and her body reacted before her mind caught up to the memory. She did not see Adrian cross the room. She only felt, suddenly, the absence of Lord Caro's hand, and looked up to find Adrian's fingers closed around the man's wrist, his face perfectly calm, his voice perfectly even. "Lord Caro," Adrian said, "you'll forgive me. My intended does not care for surprises." Caro, sensing something in the Duke's stillness that felt far more dangerous than any raised voice, apologized and retreated without argument. Adrian released his wrist and turned to Alina, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He did not ask what had happened. He did not demand an explanation, did not press her for the reason her whole body had gone cold at a touch that should have meant nothing. He simply offered his arm in full view of the ballroom and said, quietly, only for her, "We can leave if you'd prefer it." "I'd prefer it," Alina admitted. They left without further comment, and in the carriage home, in the dark and the quiet, Alina found herself grateful for a silence that asked nothing of her, from a man the whole city believed incapable of gentleness, and understood with a small and unwelcome certainty that the 6 weeks she had agreed to were beginning to feel like something she was no longer counting down. Neither of them spoke of the ballroom again, not directly, though something in the house had shifted after it, some careful distance neither of them had bothered maintaining as closely as before. Adrian no longer raised his voice near her, not even in frustration over correspondence, not even when a supplier tried to cheat him on timber prices, and Alina watched him grip the edge of his desk instead of his temper. She noticed. She never asked him to explain the change, and he never offered to, but she noticed, the way she had once told Della that noticing was never a fault. It was 3 weeks into the arrangement when Della fell ill with a fever that would not break, and the house that had slowly become something like a home turned, for 2 days, into something closer to a vigil. Alina sat beside the girl's bed through the worst of the first night, pressing cool cloths to her forehead, humming half-remembered songs whose words she'd forgotten years ago, and did not notice Adrian standing in the doorway until well past midnight, watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before, something unguarded and afraid in equal measure. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I can sit with her." "I'm not tired," Alina lied. He came and sat anyway on the opposite side of the small bed, and for a long while neither of them spoke, listening to Della's uneven breathing, watching the candle burn lower, until Adrian finally said into the dark, "My brother sat like this. The last week. I remember thinking someone should be doing something, and there was nothing to do but sit." Alina did not interrupt him. She had learned, somewhere in the last 3 weeks, that Adrian's silences were not emptiness but rooms he was deciding whether to let her into. "He asked me to take her," Adrian went on. "Della, in the last conversation we had when he could still speak in full sentences, he made me promise I wouldn't let her grow up cold. He said it like a warning, not a request, as though he already suspected I would fail at it." "You haven't failed," Alina said. "I don't know how to be anything but what the title made me," Adrian said. "Everyone in this city decided long ago what kind of man I am. I stopped correcting them because it was easier than trying and being wrong about myself in front of an audience. But she's 7, Alina. She needs someone who isn't performing warmth. She needs someone who has it. I've watched you with her every night for 3 weeks, Alina said. I have never once seen you perform anything. Whatever the city believes about you, it has clearly never been in this room at midnight, watching you hold a fever cloth like it might break if you're not careful. Adrian looked at her then, really looked, in a way that made the small room feel smaller still, and said nothing for a long moment, as though weighing whether the truth was safe to give away. My husband liked being obeyed, Alina said suddenly, surprising herself with the admission, 4 words she had never spoken aloud to another living person. She did not explain further. She did not need to. She watched something settle behind Adrian's eyes, some piece of the ballroom finally making sense to him, and he did not ask for more than she had given, did not press for the rest of the story the way lesser men might have, hungry for the details of someone else's pain. He simply reached across the narrow bed and covered her hand with his briefly and said only, "Thank you for telling me that much." It was, Alina would think later, the single kindest thing anyone had done for her since Robert's death, this refusal to demand more than she had chosen to give. Della's fever broke by morning. The house exhaled, and something between Alina and Adrian, some careful wall neither of them had named aloud, had quietly come down in the dark beside a sickbed and did not go back up again afterward. It was 2 nights after Della recovered that the doorway happened. Alina had gone looking for a book she'd left in the study, expecting the room empty, and found Adrian instead, still awake near midnight, a glass of untouched brandy at his elbow and papers scattered across his desk that he did not appear to be reading. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face, tired and unguarded in a way the daylight version of him never allowed, made her pause in the doorway rather than retreat. "You're still awake," she said. "So are you." "I couldn't sleep. I came for a book." "Which one?" "I don't remember anymore," she admitted, and he almost smiled, and it was that almost smile more than anything else that undid the careful distance she had been keeping since the ballroom. She crossed the room without deciding to. He rose from behind the desk without deciding to. And somewhere between the desk and the door, in the space where neither of them had planned to stop, they did stop, close enough that she could see the exact moment his composure gave way to something else entirely. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The kiss that followed was not the performance either of them had agreed to at the start of this arrangement, was nothing at all like the careful, distant courtesy of a business transaction, and when it ended, both of them stepped back at once, as though they had touched something that burned. "That shouldn't have happened," Adrian said, his voice rougher than usual. "No," Alina agreed, "it shouldn't have." Neither of them moved to correct it further. Neither of them apologized. They simply stood there, breathing unevenly in the low candlelight, until Alina finally excused herself and returned to her room without the book she'd come for, and lay awake long past dawn, turning the moment over in her mind like a stone she could not put down. She did not see Della on the stairs, watching the whole thing from the shadows with the wide, delighted eyes of a 7-year-old who had just confirmed something she'd suspected for weeks, or hear the girl's small, satisfied laugh as she crept back to bed with a secret she had no intention of keeping quiet for long. The days that followed carried a new kind of tension, not the wariness of strangers performing an arrangement, but something far more dangerous. The careful politeness of 2 people trying very hard not to acknowledge what they both now knew to be true. Alina caught herself watching Adrian's hands during breakfast, remembering the exact weight of them. Adrian caught himself listening for her laughter through the walls of his study, missing it on the morning's business kept him elsewhere. Neither of them spoke of the arrangement's end anymore, though it loomed closer with every passing day, the court date drawing near, the 6 weeks bleeding down toward 5, then 4. Alina had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to dread the arithmetic of it, the counting down that had once felt like relief, and now felt like loss waiting to happen. It was Della who finally said the thing neither adult would. "You're going to marry him for real," the girl announced one afternoon, apropos of nothing, while sitting cross-legged on Alina's bedroom floor sorting through a box of ribbons with the seriousness of a general planning a campaign. "I heard you both. In the study. Grown-ups always think children don't notice things, but I notice everything, you know that." "Della," Alina said carefully, "the arrangement between your uncle and me is complicated." "It's not complicated," Della said, with the brutal simplicity only a child could manage. "He looks at you like you're the only warm room in a cold house. You look at him like you forgot you were supposed to be careful. That's not complicated. That's just true." Alina did not have an answer for that. She sat on the edge of her bed and looked at this small, fierce girl who had lost a father and gained, in some accidental way neither adult had planned for, something that felt increasingly like a mother, and felt the full weight of what it would mean to walk away from this house when the 6 weeks ended, not just from Adrian, but from Della too. "What happens to me?" Della asked, quieter now, the bravado gone out of her voice entirely, "when the wedding doesn't happen? When you go back to your own house and Uncle Adrian goes back to being the man everyone's scared of, and I go back to being the girl whose parents both died? What happens to me then?" Alina had no answer for that either, and the absence of one sat in the room like a held breath neither of them knew how to release, a question that would not stay quiet much longer, no matter how carefully the adults tried to keep it locked away. The letter arrived on a Thursday, delivered not by post but by hand, a footman in unfamiliar livery leaving it with Adrian's steward and departing before anyone could ask who had sent him. Adrian read it standing in his study, and Alina, entering to discuss the seating arrangement for an upcoming dinner, watched his face go still in a way she had learned to recognize as something far worse than anger. "What is it?" she asked. "Lord Pemberton," Adrian said, "has written to inform me that he has reason to believe our engagement is not what it appears. He does not say this to the court directly, not yet. He says it to me, as a courtesy, before he decides whether courtesy is warranted." Alina felt the floor tilt the way it had the morning the men came for her furniture. How could he know? "I don't know that he does know," Adrian said. "I think he suspects, and suspicion is enough for a man like Pemberton, who has wanted my guardianship of Della overturned since the day my brother died, because a court-appointed custody arrangement would place him, as the next eligible relation, in a position to manage her inheritance until she comes of age. He wants the money. He wants the money, and he wants to see me humbled in front of every person who has ever feared me, both in equal measure." Adrian set the letter down carefully, as though it might detonate if handled roughly. "He proposes an alternative to exposing us. He suggests that if the marriage does not happen, truly happen, before the court convenes, he will ensure the judges hear every reason to doubt its authenticity. If it does happen, he has no grounds to challenge anything." "So we are back to a transaction," Alina said quietly. "Except now the price is a real marriage, forced by a man neither of us has chosen." "I would not call it forced," Adrian said, though his voice had lost some of its usual certainty. "Not entirely." "Wouldn't you?" Alina felt something cold rising in her chest, something that had nothing to do with Pemberton and everything to do with the ballroom, with the doorway, with the 4 words she'd given Adrian in the dark beside Della's sickbed. A week ago this would have been easy. 6 weeks, a settlement, a clean ending. Now you're asking me to marry you because a man threatens to expose a lie, and I cannot tell any more whether you want this marriage or whether you simply want to win against Pemberton. That isn't fair. Isn't it? Tell me honestly, Adrian. If Pemberton had never written that letter, would you have asked me to stay past the 6 weeks at all, or would you have let me go quietly, the way we agreed, and called it a mercy? Adrian did not answer immediately, and in his silence, Alina heard everything she feared most, that he had not yet decided, that whatever had grown between them in this house remained, even now, tangled up with obligation and timing, and a threat neither of them had asked for. "I need to think," she said, before he could find the words, and left the study before he could stop her. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her room with her trunk half-packed, the same trunk she had arrived with weeks ago, and told herself that leaving now, before the wedding, before the papers, before anything became permanent, was the only choice that protected what remained of her pride. It was Della who found her, well past midnight, standing in the doorway in her nightgown with her hair loose and her feet bare against the cold floor, looking at the half-packed trunk with an expression far too old for a child her age. "You're leaving," Della said. It was not a question. "I don't know," Alina admitted, because she owed this girl honesty even when she could not manage it for herself. "I don't know what the right thing is anymore, Della. I came here to save my own life, and somewhere along the way I forgot I was only borrowing yours and your uncle's for 6 weeks, and now I don't know how to give it back without breaking something." "Then don't give it back," Della said, with the simple, devastating logic only a child could offer. "You keep saying you don't know things. I know things. I know that before you came, this house was quiet in a bad way, the kind of quiet where nobody says anything because there's nothing left to say. And now it's quiet in a good way sometimes and loud in a good way other times, and you did that. Not the wedding, not the court, you. And if you leave because some horrible man wrote a letter, then you're not leaving because you don't want to stay. You're leaving because you're scared, and that's not the same thing, and I think you're smart enough to know the difference." Alina stared at this small, fierce girl standing barefoot in a doorway at midnight, delivering the truth with none of the softening adults usually applied to hard things, and felt something in her chest crack open. "You're the only one who ever stayed," Della said, quieter now, her bravado finally giving out. "Before you, nobody stayed. My mother died when I was small. My father died last year. Everyone I love disappears, and I understand it, I do. I'm not stupid, but I don't want you to be one more person who disappears, Alina. I don't want that." Alina did not have words for what rose in her then, something too large and too old to name cleanly, and she crossed the room and pulled Della into her arms instead, holding her the way she had wished someone had held her in the weeks after Robert died, and did not let go for a long time. She did not unpack the trunk that night, not entirely, but she stopped filling it either. And in the morning, when Adrian came to find her, his own face carrying the exhaustion of a man who had not slept, she did not tell him she was staying, because she was not yet certain of it herself. But she also did not tell him she was leaving, and for now, that uncertainty was the only honesty she had to offer. The court date arrived faster than either of them wanted. Pemberton had made good on the smaller part of his threat, if not the larger, and word had spread through certain circles that the Duke's engagement was, perhaps, less solid than it appeared. A formal custody hearing was called, earlier than planned, with Pemberton's solicitor present, and a request already filed to have Della's guardianship reviewed by an independent investigator before any final decision was made. The investigator, a stern woman named Mrs. Aldercott, with a reputation for seeing through exactly the kind of performance Alina and Adrian had built their arrangement upon, arrived at the house 3 days before the hearing, unannounced, with the clear intention of observing the household as it truly was rather than as it wished to appear. Alina watched Adrian's composure fracture in ways she had never seen, watched him pace his study late into the night reviewing every possible outcome, watched him sit across from Della at breakfast and ask, with a rawness that undid her entirely, whether the girl understood that whatever happened in court, he would not stop fighting for her. "I know that," Della said simply, buttering her toast with the same seriousness she applied to everything. "You've never once made me doubt that, not even when you were sad, not even when you thought I wasn't watching." It was Alina, in the end, who made the decision that Adrian had been too afraid to ask her to make. She found him in his study the night before the hearing, still awake, still surrounded by papers he could not concentrate on, and stood in the doorway the way she had that first night, except this time she did not hesitate before crossing the room. "I'm not leaving," she said, before he could speak. "Not because of Pemberton, and not because of the court, and not because it would be easier than packing a trunk twice. I'm staying because somewhere in the last 5 weeks, this stopped being a transaction, and I would rather face whatever comes tomorrow as your wife in truth than walk away from the only home that has felt like mine since Robert died." Adrian rose from behind his desk slowly, as though afraid too sudden a movement might prove this were a dream he'd wake from. "You don't have to say that because of the hearing," he said carefully. "I won't hold you to a promise made under threat, Alina. Not from me, not from Pemberton, not from anyone." "I know I don't have to," she said. "That's precisely why I'm saying it." He crossed the room to her then, and this time neither of them stepped back afterward. Neither of them called it a mistake. And when he asked her, quietly, formally, if she would truly marry him, not for the court, not for Pemberton, but because he could no longer imagine the house, or himself, without her in it, she said yes before he had even finished the question, and meant it more completely than she had meant anything in the 2 long years since she had first learned how to survive alone. The wedding was arranged within 4 days, small and quiet, held in the same chapel where Adrian's parents had married decades before, with only Della, a handful of trusted staff, and a vicar who asked no questions about the haste. Mrs. Aldercott attended as well, at Adrian's own invitation, a decision Alina had questioned at first and understood only later, when she realized he wanted the investigator to see for herself that whatever the court believed about the timing, nothing about the marriage itself was false. Alina stood at the entrance of the chapel that morning with her hands folded tightly in front of her, feeling the same hollow, floor-tilting sensation she had felt the morning the men came for her furniture, except this time the fear was not of losing everything, but of how much she now stood to lose if any part of this went wrong. She ran the shipping numbers through her head without meaning to, the old habit of counting something steady when everything else felt uncertain, and did not notice Adrian watching her from the front of the chapel until Della tugged gently at her sleeve. "You're doing the numbers thing," Della whispered, with the knowing air of a child who had learned to read every adult in her orbit. "You do that when you're nervous. Uncle Adrian does the jaw thing. You'd think 2 grown-ups getting married for real would be less scared than a 7-year-old, but here we all are." Alina laughed despite herself, the sound loosening something tight in her chest, and Della beamed up at her with the particular satisfaction of a child who has successfully talked an adult out of their own fear, even briefly. The walk down the short aisle felt longer than it should have. Alina watched Adrian's face the entire way, watched the careful stillness he wore in public begin to crack the closer she came, watched something raw and unguarded rise to the surface that she had only ever seen from him in the dark, in a sick room, in a doorway, in the small hours when no one else was watching. Here, in the daylight, in front of witnesses, he let her see it anyway, and that alone told her more than any vow could. The vicar's words were the same words spoken in every chapel in the city, the same contract language that had shaped this arrangement from its very first hour in Grady's ink-stained office. But when Adrian said "I will," it did not sound like a man closing a transaction. It sounded like a man surprised by his own certainty, as though he had expected, even now, some part of himself to hesitate, and found instead that no hesitation came. Alina answered before the vicar had finished asking, the words rising out of her faster than propriety allowed, and the small, startled ripple of laughter that moved through the handful of witnesses only made her more certain she had answered correctly. They were married within the hour, and by the time the papers were signed and witnessed, Pemberton's challenge had already begun to lose its footing, though none of them yet knew how thoroughly. The court convened 2 days later, in a wood-paneled room that smelled of dust and old authority, with 3 judges seated behind a raised bench and Pemberton's solicitor, presenting his case with the confident polish of a man who believed the outcome already settled in his favor. He spoke of the suspiciously rapid engagement, the widow's convenient financial rescue, the timing that aligned too neatly with the court's own deadline to be coincidence rather than calculation. Alina sat beside Adrian through all of it, her hand resting in his, feeling the familiar cold creep of old fear at being scrutinized so publicly, and found, this time, that his presence beside her steadied rather than smothered it, the way it had in the ballroom weeks ago, the way it had every day since. It was Mrs. Aldercott who spoke next, called by the court to give her independent findings, and Alina felt her stomach drop at the thought of what the investigator might have observed in those 3 unannounced days at the house, whether she had seen enough of the truth or only enough of the performance to be uncertain. "I observed a household," Mrs. Aldercott said, in the flat, unhurried tone of a woman who had spent decades learning to see past performance, in which the child in question was calm, well cared for, and demonstrably attached to both adults under review. "I observed no signs of distress, neglect, or discomfort. Whatever the timing of this marriage, I found nothing in that home to suggest the child's welfare has been anything but the household's first priority." Pemberton's solicitor pressed further, requesting the court hear directly from the child herself, a request clearly intended to unsettle a 7-year-old into contradicting the careful narrative the adults around her had supposedly constructed. Alina felt Adrian's hand tighten around hers, felt her own breath catch at the thought of Della being made to perform under pressure in a room full of strangers. But Della, when called forward, climbed into the witness chair with the same solemn seriousness she brought to sorting ribbons, folded her hands in her lap, and looked directly at the judges without a trace of the nervousness the room clearly expected. "You may ask her whatever is relevant," the presiding judge said to Pemberton's solicitor, "but I will not tolerate distress caused to this child for the sake of argument." The solicitor, somewhat wrong-footed by a witness who did not appear frightened, asked his question carefully. "Della, can you tell the court how long you have known your aunt, Mrs. Hartley, as she was?" "6 weeks before the wedding," Della said. "But that's not a very good question if I'm honest. It doesn't matter how long you've known someone. It matters what they do while they're there." A ripple of quiet amusement moved through the room, quickly suppressed. The judge did not smile, but something in his posture eased slightly. "And what has she done, in your observation?" the solicitor asked, recovering. "She sat with me the whole night I had the fever, even though nobody made her," Della said. "She let me hide under the table on her very first day here, instead of telling me to come out and behave properly like a lady, which is what everybody else always says. She argued with a mean shipping man in our hallway and won, and my uncle only had to step in at the very end because he wanted to. Not because she needed him to. And she almost left once. I know that because I saw the trunk, but she stayed. And I think the reason people matter isn't whether they arrive quickly or whether the timing looks proper to grown-ups in a courtroom. I think it's whether they stay when it would be easier to go. She stayed. My uncle learned how to be soft by watching her be soft with me first, and I don't think that's something you fake for 6 weeks or 6 months or however long this has all taken. I think that's just who they are now, whatever they were before." The room was very quiet when she finished. Even Pemberton's solicitor, for a long moment, had nothing further to ask. The judges did not deliberate long. The guardianship was confirmed within the hour, the marriage recognized without further challenge, and Pemberton's petition dismissed with a firmness that left little room for future appeal. He left the courtroom without a word to anyone. His ambitions regarding Della's inheritance ended as thoroughly as his credibility. Outside, on the courthouse steps, Della threw her arms around Alina's waist with the particular relief of a child who had done something brave and was only now allowing herself to feel the fear that had come before it. "I told the truth," she said, muffled against Alina's coat. "I didn't even have to think about what to say. It was just true, so I said it." "It was the bravest thing I have ever seen," Alina said, holding her tightly and meant every word. Adrian stood watching them both, and when Alina looked up to find his expression, she saw none of the careful stillness he had worn the day she first met him in that shadowed study, none of the coldness the city had spent years building into legend. What she saw instead was a man entirely undone, openly, without performance, in front of a courthouse full of strangers who no longer mattered to either of them. Life did not become simple after that exactly, because life rarely does, but it settled, in the weeks that followed, into something neither Alina nor Adrian had quite believed themselves capable of building. The shipping ledgers moved from Alina's old, cold townhouse into a sunlit corner of the study, where she worked most afternoons while Adrian handled his own correspondence nearby. The two of them working in companionable silence, broken only by Della's occasional interruption to report on the emotional states of various household issues. The city's whispers changed slowly, the way whispers do, from fear of the reaper of Kestrel Hall to something closer to bewildered respect for a duke who had, against every expectation, built himself an actual family rather than merely the appearance of one. Alina stopped flinching at raised voices in time, because there were no raised voices in this house worth flinching from, and Adrian stopped believing, in time, that his brother's warning about growing cold had ever truly applied to him, not with a niece who narrated his moods through breakfast and a wife who had taught him, without either of them fully realizing it was happening, how to be loved out loud. On a quiet evening some months later, Alina sat at her ledger by the fire, papers spread across her lap, while Adrian read beside her. No audience, no performance, nothing left to prove to a court or a city or even to themselves. Della had fallen asleep between them on the settee, one hand still curled around a ribbon she had refused to put down all afternoon, and for a long while neither adult moved to disturb her. No one was watching them now. No investigator observed from the doorway, no judge weighed their behavior, no whispering ballroom crowd waited to catch them out. There was only the fire, and the quiet, and the small, steady sound of a girl breathing easily between two people who had once agreed to pretend, and had somehow, without ever quite deciding to, stopped pretending altogether. They stayed anyway, not because anyone required it of them any longer, but because, at last, staying was simply what they wanted to do.